Hi, this is a recreation of a paper presented at the 9th Annual Shakespeare Conference in Toronto, Canada on October 17, 2013. I'd like to thank Lewisburg College and the staff for helping me recreate that lecture today. I'd like to thank you all for allowing me to present this paper to you today. I'm very aware of the theme of this year's conference, Shakespeare and the Living Theater. Today, I'm going to talk to you about evidence, about skepticism, and about a method of examining evidence using a technique utilized by actors for decades. Along the way, I'm going to let you know that we need more historians and more trained historical researchers on the Shakespeare authorship question. We need more skeptical people. People that are skeptical about all research, not just their own, but others as well. And about logical fallacies and cognitive biases and the mistakes we all make in everyday thinking that contribute to the way research is handled. Well, as many of you know, I have a law degree. And one of the most terrorizing courses at my law school was the course that should have been most boring. It was called Real Property. And real property law really hasn't changed a whole lot since 1928. But the professor was right out of Professor Kingsley's book in the movie The Paper Chase, which some of you may remember. He would look at you and he would say, "Mr. Patton, please give us a case of Wellenkamp versus Bank of America." And you'd have to stand up and give the case. And he would say, "Well, if this fact was changed, would your outcome be any different? If this fact was changed?" And as he kept changing facts and you kept answering what you thought logically, you would realize that he was leading you down the primrose path to academic destruction because your conclusion was going to be absurd. You knew you were in for it. And the last thing he would say to you before he set you down, embarrassed and shamefaced, was, "What's your authority for that statement?" And you would have none. Professor Curtis was a terror. Very nice man, actually, but a terror in law school, because he would always ask you this question when you gave him your analysis of this case. That depiction of the law student is dead on. It really is. Now, as I went from law school to practicing law to other adventures, such as the Shakespeare authorship question, these are the questions that substituted for me for what's your authority for that statement. What evidence leads you to conclude that this play was written by this author? Why is this evidence so good and so convincing to you that it would cause you to decide this? And finally, I concluded that there has to be a logical, consistent, and objective way of examining evidence in order to determine its worth in resolving authorship questions. Well, I figured, okay, I'm a lawyer. This is a great place to start, right? The law of evidence. I took a course for an entire year on this in law school. I should know what I'm talking about. And I do. The federal rules of evidence, all those things about hearsay that you see on the courtroom drama shows, I know all that stuff. I figured this would be a great place to start on analyzing evidence. The truth is, it's not. You see, the rules of evidence are designed to keep bad evidence out, not to judge the truth or falsity of the evidence, not to judge how good the evidence is or how bad the evidence is. Who makes that decision? The trier of fact, the judge or jury. They decide what evidence they're going to believe, what evidence they're going to throw out, etc., etc. Most of the law regarding evidence exists only to determine its admissibility, to what the jury can hear. We'll talk about hearsay after a while, but that's one of those things you've always heard, right? All right, so the laws of evidence? Not really. All right, now, first book I'm going to talk to you about is Harold Lowe's book, Attributing Authorship. There are some wonderful things in here, but most of it serves as a definition for our discussion today. We want to talk about the difference between internal evidence and external evidence. Internal evidence is from the work itself, and external evidence is evidence from the social world in which the work is created, promulgated, and read. But there will always be overlap. What does he mean? Well, external evidence are three things. Contemporary attributions from documents purporting to impart information about the circumstances of composition, such as diaries, payments, publishers' records, records of payment, and legal proceedings. External evidence also includes biographical information that is not found between the covers of the book. All this goes out the window, by the way, if it's an autobiography. But for plays and poems and novels and other works of fiction, This is external evidence. Biographical information about the author, including the location, personal associations, religious business affiliations, etc. And the third thing is the history of earlier attributions of the work, and especially the circumstances under which they were made. There are several plays in the Shakespearean canon which can be traced back to earlier plays. There's a play called The Famous Victories of Henry V, which was written in 1588, or at least published then. That's a time when Shakespeare from Stratford could not have been in London. So that is a bad thing if that play became Henry V, the play we know today. Same thing with an old play called King Lear, spelled L-E-I-R, about which a paper is going to be presented later in this conference. You have to know the history of the earlier attributions. External evidence allows us to place the work in its own time, its own place, and its own culture. In other words, in context. Internal evidence, by contrast, is evidence found between the covers of the book. In other words, what style the author used. Any self-reference and self-presentation within the work. And evidence of the themes, ideas, beliefs, and conceptions of genre manifested in the text. 2 and 3, by the way, Harold Love says 2 and 3 will always overlap. The distinction in any given work, in any given argument, depends on whether the researcher is working inward from the context, in other words, from the world outside and working in, or outward from the detail of the text. Internal evidence allows us to compare and contrast, for instance, between one style and another. If we see a style that's reminiscent in one work that we know who the author is, then we can sort of say, okay, this looks like the style of this guy, and we can do it that way. Style, pattern, set of clues, what that pattern or set of clues may mean. That's all internal evidence. All right? The next thing is Love's last word on the subject. This is really important. We have internal evidence to determine who the author is. We have some external evidence. None of this matters when solid evidence of both kinds points to the same result. But when there's a conflict between them, we have to judge which of the two is more persuasive, or else deliver an open verdict. This must depend entirely on the quality and persuasiveness of the research presented. In other words, the evidence. How good is it on one side or the other? Love says neither kind should be given priority by fiat. You should never say, okay, internal evidence is always better than external evidence, or vice versa. Can't do that. External evidence exists outside the work and helps construct the context of the work around a possible author. And yes, external evidence does include title pages. My professor, Elizabeth Evenden at Brunel, when I was getting my master's, got me addicted to title pages. I can spend all day with a title page. I'm a very sick man. But I love title pages, especially in early modern work. Internal evidence is the evidence gleaned from inside the work. Its structure, its style, or in the new language of Professor Brian Vickers' stylometry, its words, its construction, everything that exists inside the work itself. All right. The next book you have to get, although it is not cheap, is this book called Reconstructing Contexts, the Principles and Aims of Archaeohistoricism. This is a great book. It is written by a professor of English literature at Penn State University. His name is Robert Hume. What I will do, it is a must-read for every serious researcher. Let me just give you a few nuggets from this man's book. He says that archaeohistoricism, and you can see the hyphenation of the words means there's two different things here, comprises both the reconstruction of the context, in other words, building the archaeology around the text, and the interpretation of the text within the context itself. In all literary interpretation, there's always a tension between context and text, and sometimes we don't know much about that. The historicist method, the way we do this, is, well, we always begin with the object of finding the truth. The approach is from the bottom up. In other words, one approaches the subject with no prior commitment to any theory about who actually done it, or the primary method, the organization of it, or explanation of it. We don't come to it with any prior explanation in mind. We have to be committed to the truth and to the discovery of what is both true and reliable. Hume says that few members of literature departments have any training in archival research. And he says, and of course he's a member of a literature department at Penn State, he says that's a result of the emphasis on reading and on theory. Research is way down the list of most literature department folks. Statements about genesis, context, and reception must be backed up by hard documentation or they're worthless. This is my favorite quote from Professor Hume. Where the guiding principle is a will to believe, Hume says, the concept of verification goes out the window. And if the results are not submitted to a serious challenge and validation, they can be no more than fairy stories to amuse us. He gets right on the edge of this too, especially with the Shakespeare stuff. He says the practice of archaeohistoricism rests on the availability of evidence, perhaps because so much literary scholarship consists of textual analysis, and because British and American literature often very large numbers of text to interpret, they offer that. The acquisition of evidence has rarely been considered a pressing problem. For a man who is one of the deans of the literature department at Penn State, he has a rather scathing indictment on English literature, folks. He says, how many scholars have dug with fanatic enthusiasm to discover any tiny fragment about Shakespeare? With how much result? The answer is not much result. We've been digging for 400 years for stuff on Shakespeare. We haven't found any of his notes, his manuscripts, not a single letter, not anything to indicate that he was a writer, except the title pages of the book. What we do not know about Shakespeare is enough to have generated many books of irresponsible speculation written to fill the vacuum. We turn to the plays on the risky supposition that he wrote them all himself. But what would lead us to imagine that Shakespeare's plays are a faithful mirror of the psyche and opinions of their creator? We really don't know that, do we? Scholars are accustomed to concentrate on what they have. Good historical practice requires us to be blunt in admitting what we lack, and we lack a great deal of knowledge about Shakespeare. This is my favorite quote from Hume. Looking at the facts collected in Mr. Shanebaum's Shakespeare, A Documentary Life, one sees how pitifully limited and impersonal the evidence is. But living with it strikes me as a better idea than writing a biography in the fashion of A.L. Rouse. Most biographies, even according to the orthodox scholars, of course, are about 5% fact and about 95% imagination. You read one and you'll say, he must have. He almost certainly did. It's all speculation and fantasy. And yet, there's a major biography of Shakespeare that's been coming out every year since 1930-something probably. And they've made millions of dollars on them. They don't know. They really don't know. Students are often advised to say, I don't know, when stumped by an examiner, and scholars could do worse than apply the lessons to themselves. Good ones do. I like to tell my students the known facts about Shakespeare you could fill up the back of a matchbook with a grease pencil. But since my students know not what a matchbook or a grease pencil is, the joke falls kind of flat nowadays. All right, skepticism. Let's go to Skepticism 101. I have somebody else to thank for that. His name is Dr. Michael Schimmer. He has a great course on this, which I am very indebted to. And I'm going to talk to you today about being a skeptic. We're skeptical about a lot of things on television, the Weekly World News, the newspaper checkout. We're skeptical about a lot of things. We're not as skeptical as we should be about ourselves, about our own mistakes in thinking, our own fallacies in thinking. This is what I'm going to start with, though. Skepticism is the application of science and reason to test the validity of a claim of truth or belief. I already thanked Mr. Shermer, so I'm not going to do it again. The important question to ask is, what are the particular facts in support of or against a claim? All right? Who are skeptics? Well, hopefully we all are. We're curious but cautious. We believe many things as long as there's reasons and evidence to believe, or a high statistical probability exists that allow us to believe. We are talking about belief as a matter of course, not faith. Faith is a different proposition, although there are folks who will tell you on both sides of the Shakespeare authorship question that it is a matter of faith for them as well. Skeptics are rational and empirical people. They're logical. It means thinking and seeing before believing. Skeptics are a balance between a total commitment to the status quo and the blind pursuit of new ideas, somewhere in the middle there. Skepticism is not seek and ye shall find. Rather, skepticism is seek and keep an open mind. It's the same thing that we talk about in archaeohistoricism. Don't be committed to anything before you find out all the facts. There's a negative correlation, as you might guess, between education and superstition. As education increases, superstitious beliefs decrease. College professors, for example, are more skeptical of paranormal than either college students or the general public. However, English professors, it was found, which is kind of scary because I teach English, are more likely to believe in ghost fortune-telling, ESPN, and perhaps Shakespeare. English professors, it was found, are also able to defend and rationalize their beliefs, however weird, because they're better at argument. And once settled, they are less open to considering other positions. I've thought about this, and I believe it's easier to walk into a religion department in a major university and say, there is no God, than it is to walk into an English department and say, I'm not sure the guy from Stratford wrote the works attributed to William Shakespeare. I think in the religion department you would get cogent, calm, rational, reasonable, and collegial argument. I think in the English department you would get called names and thrown out, and that actually does happen. Consider this question from a course I'm teaching this year on success in college. The mark of reasonable educated people is blank. The answers are A, the degree they hold from their alma mater; B, their ability to persuade others into believing the claims they make; C, their willingness to change their minds; or D, the job they hold and how it relates to their college degree. The correct answer, of course, is C. A true scholar is always, always willing to change their mind because they are reasonable, educated people. Most of my students got that right. I'm teaching them a lot about critical thinking this year. Bottom line, it's not enough to be smart or educated. You have to know how to use your intelligence in a particular way. Skepticism leads you to a better understanding of the way the world works. And my favorite phrase from one of my favorite teachers, the more you learn, the more you realize, the less you know. Very important, especially our skepticism stuff. What are the facets of skepticism? Well, first you've got to use your intelligence to explore and be open to new knowledge. Here we are. Mistakes in thinking we all make. First one is Feynman's principle, which was just quoted on The Big Bang Theory the other night on an episode. He was a famous physicist. You must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. We really are, aren't we? And Hume's maxim, a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. And yes, that's the same Robert Hume. Let's go through a few fallacies in thinking we all make. It's easy to recognize this in other people. It is tougher to recognize it in ourselves, and we must have both of those qualities available to us. I'll go through these. The first one we make, especially in the authorship of Shakespeare and the argumentarian, is the fallacy of misplacing the burden of proof. In Shakespeare authorship studies, we have to recognize this, that we as doubters have the burden of proof in making this extraordinary claim, that perhaps the man from Stratford-upon-Avon did not write the plays attributed to William Shakespeare. We have the burden of proof, and sometimes we act like, well, these are the facts, and this is here, and this is here, and this is there. So what are you going to do to refute it? It's not up to them to refute it. It's not up to the establishment to refute the claim. In an extraordinary claim, it is up to us to prove it. Let's go into a little Latin here. Ad ignorantium. If you cannot disprove a claim, it must be true. In other words, I say aliens landed last night in Lewisburg. Can you disprove that? Can you show me for a fact that no aliens landed? Well, then it must be true. That's a fallacy in thinking. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, because of this. That is, means it's basically, since event Y followed event X, then X must have caused Y. It rained, therefore I slipped on the sidewalk. Not necessarily. It's often shortened to simply post hoc. Continuing with our Latin theme today, we have ad hominem, which we all understand. Many of us get called bad names for even bringing up the subject of Shakespeare's authorship and other things that we bring up in our everyday lives. It's Latin for to the man. It redirects the focus of thinking about the idea to thinking about the person holding the idea. In other words, I'm not going to attack the concept that Shakespeare had no literary training per se, probably never owned a book, and might have been functional illiterate. With my research, they're going to attack me and say I'm stupid or crazy or conspiracy theorist. Shakespeare authorship doubters have been called Holocaust deniers. They've been called 9/11 deniers. They've been called conspiracy theorists in the worst way. Nobody in this room is one of those people. None of us. We're looking at the facts and making conclusions and working on evidence. Either or. That's the fallacy of negation, right? Discrediting one position forces the acceptance of the other position. In other words, If you don't believe in aliens, then you must be crazy. It's either or. You're either rational and believe in aliens, or you're irrational because you don't believe them. Okay. What else we got? Circular reasoning. This is one of my favorite ones. Circular reasoning occurs when the claim or conclusion is merely a restatement of one of the premises. We can do this with God and gravity. I'll do the one with God. You guys can figure it out on gravity. Okay? There is a God. Why? Because it's written in the Bible. The Bible says so. Why? Because God wrote the Bible. It works the same thing with gravity. You figure it out. That's circular reasoning. The last one on this page is reductio ad absurdum. Love all this language of the Latins. It's called the slippery slope fallacy. This is the attempt to refute an argument by carrying it to its logical and often absurd conclusions. If an argument's apparent conclusions seem absurd, then the argument itself must be false. That's not the case. Not the case. Just because you can take it to a logical and absurd conclusion doesn't mean the original argument is false. Why is this a problem? Because we all resist change, don't we? We all have an ideological immune system. Very difficult to change. We all have beliefs that we grew up with. If you grew up as a Protestant, you may change from Catholic to Methodist, but you're probably not going to become a Muslim. If you grew up Jewish, you're probably going to stay Jewish. If you grew up Hindu or Buddhist or agnostic, most of the time you're not going to change that because that's your bedrock. That's your ideological immune system. We have to recognize that we have that. Spinoza's dictum says that I have made a ceaseless effort not to ridicule, not to bewail, not to scorn human actions, but to understand them. This is very, very important because you have to have that way to say, okay, this person may not be crazy. We need to understand where they're coming from. All right? Now, we go through the cognitive biases and then we can actually get to the heart of the matter. Confirmation bias. Very simple stuff. The tendency to seek and find confirming evidence in support of what we already believe. In other words, we know that the Earl of Oxford wrote the plays, or we know that Mary Sidney wrote the plays. Any evidence we find is going to be in support of what we already believe. And we ignore or rationalize or discredit disconfirming evidence. We have a tendency to do that as scholars and as people in real life, don't we? If you're a Republican, this really works well in politics. It was found that Democrats would support a welfare bill written by Republicans if they thought it was written by a Democrat. The same is true for Republicans. They would not like a welfare bill written by a Republican if they thought it was written by Democrats. That's the confirmation bias. The hindsight bias is pretty obvious. We all know it as Monday morning quarterbacking. It's a tendency to reconstruct the past to fit with present knowledge. Self-justification bias is the tendency to rationalize decisions after the fact to convince ourselves we did the best thing we could have done under the circumstances. And the attribution bias is one of the most important ones. I'm going to talk about that for a couple minutes. The attribution bias is sometimes called the fundamental attribution error, and it's the tendency to attribute different causes for our own beliefs and actions than for the belief and actions of others. In other words, we see ourselves as rational, intelligent beings, logical beings, and we see other people who disagree with us as irrational, as illogical, as unreasonable. What's the problem with this attribution bias? With this problem, makes it difficult for us to understand one another, and it makes it hard for us to see our own shortcomings. Last few are called in-group bias. That's pretty simple, isn't it? Tendency for people to value more the beliefs and attitudes of those they perceive to be members of the group, and to discount or marginalize the beliefs and attitudes of those they perceive to be members of a different group. Also, socialization, I believe, is what it's called. The negativity bias is the tendency to pay closer attention and give more weight to negative events, beliefs, and informations than to positive ones. That's the news media all over, isn't it? They always pay more attention to negative stuff than they do to positive stuff. The last one is the not invented here bias, which is the tendency to discount the value or belief or source of information that does not come from yourself or your group. That's also the part of the in-group bias. Okay? Last little thing on skepticism, which I've overloaded you with already. We're talking about compliance, attentional blindness, and the anchoring effect. Compliance is the outward apparent conformity by individuals to group norms or an authority's commands. We call this go with the flow, don't we? We go with the flow because it's easier to do it that way. Attentional blindness, the tendency to miss something obvious in general while attending to something special and specific. This man, Robert Hume, is a brilliant man. He got so close to figuring out that Shakespeare may not have written the plays, the guy from Stratford-upon-Avon may not have written his plays and poems, but then he went off in a different direction. As in researchers, as historians, as people who do research all the time, this is a major problem for scholars because we can't see the forest for the trees. We go right here and then we take this little detour. I call it a literary ADD, or the scholarly research of ooh, shiny. And we find something over here and we go, this is cool. Let me go look at that. The last thing I'll talk about is anchoring effect. The tendency to rely too heavily on a past reference or one piece of information when making decisions. Simple one here, right? Everybody's seen the wine list at a restaurant where they start with the most expensive wine and champagne and then go down. They anchor you to the idea that there's hundreds and $200 and $300 bottles of champagne, and when you get to the $22 bottle, which they buy for $3.50 from the wholesaler, you'll think that's a great price because you're anchored to the idea of expensive wines. All right. A couple others that I've not mentioned: the status quo effect, which we all know about, the tendency to opt for whatever we are used to, the status quo, and the framing effect. This is very impressive, and this is sort of like the anchoring effect. The tendency to draw different conclusions based on how the data is presented. As Shakespeare authorship skeptics, we need to be part of the folks that say, I'd like to frame the argument this way. I'd like to frame the argument as perhaps we should be skeptical about all of early modern authorship. Just because a name appears on a title page does not necessarily mean that that's the person who wrote it, because there was a huge amount in that time. There's been a whole book on it. It's called The Anonymous Renaissance by Marcy North, about how many folks wrote using assumed names. Many of them because they couldn't, because they were noblemen and it was beneath them to write plays and poems for the common people. And many of them because they were women. Many of them because they could not be caught writing, or they were writing something that was very, very seditious and treasonous, perhaps. Lots of reasons for anonymity in this particular time of tyranny, which was what Elizabeth's reign was. So, how do we get from A to B? We recognize that we have the burden of proof. We are the minority opinion. We must lobby for our opinion to be heard. We must marshal experts on our side. That's why we need more historians, more researchers, more skeptical people. And we must convince others in large groups and in small ones to support our claim, or at least be open to listening to us. All right? Here we go. Maybe we can start with authorship skepticism and work from there. We must not attack like they do. We must not say that Stanley Wells is a pompous asshat. We must not say that, because we are going on the fact of evidence that we have versus the attacks that they do. If they attack us like they do, saying we're crazy or demented or have some sort of mental flaw, which is really fun because later we'll have a couple of psychiatrists talk about that, clinical psychiatrists with their MDs. If they say those attacks, we will come out looking better in the long run. Here we go, from skepticism to evidence. We have to have a method of examining evidence objectively, questions we can ask of all pieces of evidence, questions that we can ask as scholars that are both agreed to by the orthodox folks and by us. We need a system that's tied to the principles of the scientific method, a system that shows us the historical context of the evidence, and perhaps a method that is tied to an accepted principle of acting and theater, which is, after all, what most of Shakespeare's plays were written for. Hume says, whether you have a lot of evidence or a little bit, you have to ask yourself what's reliable. He also says that every time we accept a fact, a report, a conclusion, a summary, then we are building on rotten foundations. Wrong dates, false attributions, and a lot of plain malarkey gets passed on from generation to generation as scholars plunder one another's footnotes. Somebody will say something, footnote it, and then they'll say it's fact on the next piece of research. Hume says that literary history has failed to give us a true and sufficient context for how to place great works of literature in their time, in their place, in their culture, in their context. So how we do that? Well, this is what actors use. Actors, when they're getting a character together, they ask 6 questions. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. This is how an actor does it. I'll go through this very quickly. Who's the character? What's their name? Are they strong or weak, pretty or ugly, good or evil, young or old, meek or strong-willed, healthy, injured, sick, courageous, cowardly? Are they a mixture of conflicting emotions, motives, actions, and words? The answer to that last question is yes. You're always conflicted as an actor. Otherwise, it's just one-dimensional and nobody likes you. The list goes on ad infinitum. A little more Latin lingo for you there, sorry. What's the character? What's the character doing? Are they staying or running? Doing something specific or procrastinating? Protesting? Yielding? What do they want? Most actors say something like, what's my motivation? And I usually say to them, get on stage and do the lines right or I'll kill you. For an actor, it's imperative you understand what your character wants so that you can explore the way the character does what he or she does. It's a very important question to ask yourself as an actor. When? This is very important too, right? When's the action taking place? What time of day? Is it morning or evening? You do things differently in the morning than you do in the evening, especially before you've had your first cup of coffee, right? Specifically, is it morning, evening? Is the time period different from today? Are we talking about Elizabethan England, or are we talking about Lewisburg in 2013? Remember how your character feels, how your character thinks, and perhaps even your character's view of the world may be dictated by the period in which your character lives. They had no idea about a lot of things that we know about now. You can't assume that they do. Where is important as well? Where is the action taking place? Is it London, New York, or Los Angeles? Any specific place at all? Is it taking place in your mind? There are plays out there that take place in your mind. They just did a production of Sweeney Todd that took place in an insane asylum. And there was an implication that it's all in Sweeney Todd's mind. There's a play called Man of La Mancha that takes place all in the mind of Don Quixote. People in different places think and act differently in many ways. The actor must research how people in these specific locations tend to behave so that he or she can replicate those behaviors. Where is more important than you think. Why is the crux of the issue, though? Why are you there? What are you doing what you're doing? Why are you doing what you're doing? The first thing that actors look to, of course, is the script. It usually provides answers to the first 4 questions that an actor needs to know. But why is usually the crux of character development for the actor. Why you're doing what you're doing, the truth of your character, will likely mean a successful portrayal of that character. You have to know why you're there. How are you going to achieve what you're going to achieve? Every character wants something, don't they? They want some outcome, some result. What your character is willing to do, and in fact does, that will determine how your character acts, how you feel about what you do, and help you understand the inside of your character too. Okay. This is the problem, right? There's no formalized set of rules that tells us how to decipher historical evidence. But there are truly great historical works whose power partly resides in the ability of a historian to read the evidence, to show us how to enter into the codes of evidence in order to see what the evidence is, what it shows us about the phenomenon we are interested in, what the phenomena are. We need some method of saying this is good evidence, bad evidence, some evidence, bad evidence. Here's the proposal. Let's examine pieces of external evidence closely for specifics of who, what, when, where, why, and how, and perhaps their relationship to the authorship of a specific piece of literature will be clearer. The value, if any, as good evidence of that authorship will be distinct, strong, sharp, and as well defined as it can possibly be. Then, if we can agree on the merits of evidence, perhaps we can agree on the boundaries and logistics of a strong, reasoned discussion of works of literature in which the authorship is in dispute. In the field of authorship research especially, this simple system can be remarkably effective in determining which evidence is good, which evidence is suspect, and which evidence merits little or no consideration. Here we go. Simple stuff, right? Who? Who wrote this piece of evidence? We're talking, by the way, about external evidence now. We're not talking about the work itself. We're talking about external evidence. I'll get to that in a second. Who wrote this piece of evidence? Who's speaking? Was it someone trustworthy, unbiased, or perhaps even under oath? Have they been reliable? For instance, the first biography of Shakespeare was written by a man named John Aubrey, who, according to his employer, thought little, believed not, believed everything, and confused anything. So, how reliable are they is very important. Are they knowledgeable in the area in which they're writing? This last one, what are their possible motives in writing what they've written? Are they writing it for money? Are they writing it to overthrow a king? Are they writing it because they've been summoned to court and have to give a deposition? This guy, for instance, Robert Greene, reads Groat's Worth of Wit. This is the first line, 1592, about a man who, beatified with our feathers, was the upstart crow. Thought he was able to do a shake scene better than anyone in the country. Scholars have recently attributed that to talking about Shakespeare. We think now, with new evidence, we think it was a famous actor called Edwin Allen. Who to, so to speak? Another basic question is, who's being written about? Like Green's Groat's Worth of Wit. If we don't know who's being written about, then what good is the evidence? The who in our analysis is not concerned only with who's writing the document, it's also concerned with the who about whom they are writing. For instance, this is a passage from a man named Francis Meres, who was a pastor and a rather brilliant man, called Paladis Tamia. On the outside, this looks like a commonplace book, which is something that was usually plagiarized, usually as this person is to this person is to that person, and they go down works of literature, they go down architecture, they go down art, they go all this stuff, and it's a formulaic thing. This does prove that there was some plays by Shakespeare as of 1598 when this was written. All these plays were written by that date. That's what it proves. Very good for proving that. Not sure it's good for proving the man from Stratford wrote them. What type of evidence is it? Is it external evidence or evidence contained in the work itself? We're talking about external evidence. Does this evidence have a paper trail of some kind to establish it as good evidence, or is it merely a tradition, perhaps made out of a whole cloth? What kind of evidence is it? Well, the old story about Shakespeare being caught for poaching deer in the forest, that was a tradition, completely made up of whole cloth. The tradition of Shakespeare and Ben Jonson having a merry meeting right after which Shakespeare died. No facts to back that up whatsoever. Made up of whole cloth. What is a very important question. Also, is it a travel journal or entry, official court document, a will, piece of satire, or a dedication attempting to curry favor with an aristocrat? Remember, what may also be what's being written about here, such as a party invitation. For instance, Edward Hobey wrote to Robert Cecil during Christmas of 1595 the following lines. I want you to come to this party and K. Richard present himself to your view. That was concluded by scholars to mean that Richard II by William Shakespeare was written before Christmas in 1595. What a horrible conclusion that was. K. Richard didn't even say Richard II or Richard III, didn't say the play, didn't say Shakespeare. Turns out it was a work of art that Hobey was going to show Robert Cecil. But scholars have concluded for ages and ages that that particular piece of evidence was good evidence to conclude that King Richard II, the play by Shakespeare, was written before Christmas of 1595. Wow. When was the document written? This is really important to me. As a law student, I wrote an article on legislative intent, and there were folks writing letters to the governor a month after the bill had passed, talking about what the legislative intent was, when they had been nowhere near the Capitol or heard any of the hearings on the subject. They had no idea what the legislative intent was, but the court was saying, well, because of this letter to the governor 3 weeks after the bill was passed, this is evidence of legislative intent. No, it isn't. It's not contemporaneous with the passage of the bill. Unless evidence here is contemporaneous with the event, it's not trustworthy. Especially not unless if it's a product of a contemporary eyewitness, maybe secondhand report of somebody talking about someone else saw or heard. That's called hearsay, by the way. Is it a remembrance of an event that happened last week, last month, last year, several decades ago? Is it the product of a sharp, coherent mind or an old, feeble one, like mine, trying to remember things long ago past? That is an important part of this equation. When is a very important question to ask this evidence. All right, we're almost there. Where is also an important part. And it's not as important as you might think, but it's more important than you might think. It's an important question to ask, especially in early modern scholarship, because geographical location, in a very practical way, back then, limited you to what you were writing about, when you were writing, how good the evidence is going to be. For instance, travel conditions in a period. We also need to ask about the class of the writer. Remember that aristocratic travelers made their journeys in very different ways from commoners. If you didn't have a horse, that 146-mile Waymarch path from Stratford-upon-Avon to Shakespeare's Globe, now it's Shakespeare's Globe. It was never referred to as Shakespeare's Globe during the time. 146 miles to Stratford, that was not a 3-hour journey by train or a 3.5-hour journey by car. That was a 7 to 10 day journey. With a horse, maybe 5 to 6. Maybe. It's a long way to go back in early modern England. The roads were not great. The people were not great that you met sometimes on the road. That is what I like to call a real journey of imagination. We don't know. We don't know. All right. Why is this piece of evidence relevant? Well, that's pretty simple, right? What does the evidence prove? For instance, Pallades Tamia, I told you we just looked at that. We can prove that there were 12 Shakespeare plays, or at least known to be by Shakespeare, in 1598. It doesn't prove that William Stratford wrote them. It doesn't prove anything else other than the dates of the composition. It does nothing for the authorship controversy. First point in analysis is why is to investigate the reason the piece was written. The second point is to evaluate the intended and actual consequences of the writing of the evidence. This is a beautiful, beautiful piece of work, which I've examined up close and personal at the Folger Shakespeare Library. This is the Blackfriars Gatehouse deed of 1613. Why was this preserved? This is supposed to be Shakespeare's copy, by the way. It is beautiful, isn't it? It's almost 400 years old. That's why we got to ask how. How is this piece of evidence applicable to the question of attribution? Well, a guy with a deed to a piece of property that he probably never lived in across the Thames from the theaters does not mean he wrote the plays of Shakespeare. There are other people who bought property across the way and even closer to the Globe and the Rose and the theater. Doesn't prove he wrote the plays. What it does prove is somebody really took very good care of this deed. How did this piece of information come to us used in the fashion it is being used? How, in my examination, does not just include how it was accomplished. It also means how this piece of evidence come down to us 400 years later in this condition. And what are we to make of that fact? You've got to realize in examining evidence, there's all sorts of evidence in this book called Questions of Evidence. One of them is about art history. You know what the most important piece of painting's sale document is? It's provenance. That means how the painting came from the artist all the way down to you. This provenance from the Shakespeare Blackfriars Gatehouse deed is kind of interesting. I'm going to be doing some research on it. And it is just beautiful. It is just beautiful, which makes the skeptic in me wonder if it's real or not. I'll be investigating that. But it's a fascinating piece of work. And the problem is, if there weren't so many Shakespeare forgeries around, I wouldn't have to worry about this. But there are so many things that were forged in the 1700s and the 1800s purporting to be original Shakespearean stuff by forgers like John Payne Collier that we have to investigate all of the possibilities of a document like this, so perfect, being presented as real. In art, we learn the provenance of a piece, its history and succession of ownership is an important part of assembling the history of the piece. So it should be in early modern scholarship. Hume's final word. Instead of a world in which you cannot know, and anything goes if you say so, we need productive debate about the interpretation of the evidence and the possibility of proof or disproof. Wherever our inquiries take us, we want to begin with a clear sense of purpose, the method we shall employ, and the rules by which we shall judge our results. Professor Hume says there are 5 elements to a scholarly investigation. The first one is the investigator. The second is the subject to be investigated. The third is the method by which the subject will be approached. This is part of that method. Questions which serve to focus the inquiry and the analysis. And of course, those 6 questions: who, what, when, where, why, and how. And then the 5th part of the investigation should be hypotheses developed and tested as answers to the questions posed. That's what we need to do to have a good investigation of all this. Professor Hume also says that an a priori commitment to a principle of explanation destroys the basis of intellectual inquiry. We have lots of bases from which we start our evidence. One of them is the proposition that only William of Stratford could have written Shakespeare. That's not necessarily so. We need to take that out and investigate other things. And of course, Professor Hume says the wise scholar will be polygamous rather than monogamous in espousing theory. One is free to love them as long as one is fully prepared to leave them when the occasion requires. Personally, I'd rather be an inquiring scholar than a true believer in this particular area. Thank you for your time. Do you have any questions? Anything? Thanks again. Thank you to Lewisburg College for taping this, and thank you to Robert for helping me put it on the web. Good day.